Good afternoon. Welcome to Lunch with Books live stream. Before I introduce our guest for this afternoon, I have a couple of announcements. Don't forget to stick around for the end of the program when West Virginia Senator Ryan Weld will be here to read a special resolution. There will be Wheeling and West Virginia men mentioned today. If you'd like to know more about them, go to the Ohio Valley Civil War Roundtable on Monday, June 28th at 6:30 p.m. at the Scottish Rite Cathedral on 14th Street. It's a free program open to the public. Masks are required. And Barb Perhala and Gene Finstein will be there to do a presentation on the Wheeling and other West Virginia men who were aboard the Sultana. Next week at noon in this very location, on May 4th, our live stream will be Alan Fitzpatrick. You all know Alan, who is an expert on the frontier period in Wheeling, and he is going to tell us the untold story of Isaac Zane, a third book in his trilogy. That'll be next week at noon. Now, for today, we were to have Dr. Louis Intres, the former director of the Sultana Disaster Museum in Arkansas, as one of our guests. Unfortunately, he is unable to attend due to health reasons, and we wish him a full recovery. Our presenter today is Gene Salecker. He has written a book about the Sultana disaster on the Mississippi, the Sultana explosion, April 27, 1865. That's a 1996 book, and is currently the historical consultant for the museum, the aforementioned museum, and they're doing some fundraising. So take a look at that. More recently, Salecker wrote a new book on the Sultana, which will be published by the Naval Institute Press in the spring of 2022. As I said, Senator Weld will be on toward the end after Mr. Salecker's presentation, and we will have a Q&A before we get to the resolution. Here is Gene Salecker.
Thank you, Sean. I appreciate this. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to talk a little bit about the Sultana disaster. And there were 20 West Virginians on board and one individual from Virginia. So it was important to the state of West Virginia. Now, the Sultana was actually built in January of 1863 in Cincinnati, Ohio. It was about 260 feet long and roughly 70 feet wide. The hull was 42 feet wide, but when you add the two paddle wheels on the side, it made the boat about 70 feet wide. So about almost the length of a football field and maybe about half as wide as a football field. Give you a good example. The Sultana was actually built, and hopefully y'all can see my PowerPoint here, with extra tall smokestacks. It was built by a man named Preston Lodwick, as I said, in January of 1863 at Cincinnati. And he knew that eventually Vicksburg was going to fall. General Grant was already moving against Vicksburg and Port Hudson. And Preston Lodwick knew that with the fall of Vicksburg and the opening of the Mississippi, he could make a lot of money bringing Southern cotton back up to the northern states. So he purposely put extra tall smokestacks on the Sultana just so that a spark wouldn't pop out and land on top of the cotton, which they would stack on top of this top deck here called the hurricane deck, or even on these wide guards right here on the second deck. So he had this so that you could pile up cotton all the way up to the window of the pilot house. You don't want to block the pilot, so he can't see where he's going. But all the rest of this would have been covered with cotton. And you can see pictures like this on Google and just on the internet. Only problem was that the Sultana, on its very first maiden voyage, just sort of to work the kinks out, was going upriver on the Ohio River from Cincinnati to Pittsburgh. But when it got to Wheeling, West Virginia, it couldn't get under the railroad bridge at Wheeling, West Virginia, because the smokestacks were too tall. So they had to take off whatever freight they had there, which another boat could take up to Pittsburgh. They loaded on whatever freight they could find at Wheeling and went back down river to Cincinnati. So Preston Lodwick will do this for a while until eventually he drops the Sultana down to the Mississippi River. Grant will win the Vicksburg campaign, which the Sultana helped with. It carried some Union soldiers down there, some Confederate prisoners north. And Preston Lodwick will eventually make St. Louis his home port. However, after about a year of running the Sultana from St. Louis all the way down to New Orleans and back again. He will sell his boat in March of 1865 to a group of people from St. Louis, 4 individuals. Among them was James Cass Mason, a 34-year-old, sort of what we would consider a leadfoot today. Somebody who likes to race his car is called a leadfoot. Well, James Cass Mason liked to race his steamboats. In fact, he had been the captain of a steamboat called the Belle Memphis, and he had run a race against the Sultana and beat it. But he must have seen something in the Sultana that he probably said, if that had the right captain and the right crew, it could probably be one of the fastest boats on the river. So when Preston Lodwick decides to sell his boat, James Cass Mason will buy into it. He will buy a 3/8 share of the Sultana. It was sold for Preston Lodwick had it built for $65,000. He sells it for $85,000. Captain Mason will buy a 3/8 share. However, over the years, as Mason races his boat up and down, he runs into some mechanical problems where he has to have the boilers repaired, got to have the engines repaired. He hits a couple of snags and has to have the hull repaired a couple of times. He even damages the paddle wheels coming up river on an ice-choked Mississippi River. And so he's got to have the paddle wheels replaced. This is all costing him money, which he does not have. Everybody thought that there would be a lot of money on the Mississippi once Vicksburg and Port Hudson fell. The problem is you have too many steamboats. They're all rushing down to New Orleans to pick up the Louisiana and the Mississippi cotton, Arkansas cotton, and bring it north. So you have too much competition. And eventually, James Cass Mason is going to sell a 1/8 share to his first clerk, a man named William Gambrell. The only problem is William Gambrell is expecting his second child. His wife is expecting a second child. He does not have the money to pay Mason. So Mason will cut his share in half and end up with a 1/16 minority share on the Sultana. He went from a 3/8 majority share to a 1/16 minority. People, I want you to remember, James Cass Mason is hurting for money as the beginning of April 1865 starts. On April 14th, the Sultana will leave from St. Louis and head downriver and dock at Cairo, Illinois, where it's going to pick up some freight that has come down the Ohio River. It is sitting there on the morning of April 15th, early morning of April 15th, when word is flashed through the telegraph system that Abraham Lincoln has just been shot at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. James Cass Mason is about ready to leave Cairo to go downriver on a regular trip to New Orleans, and he decides, boy, I could make a name for the Sultana by being the first boat to go downriver and spread the word of Lincoln's assassination. At this time, all the telegraph lines with the South were either torn down by Northern cavalrymen on raids or by Southern guerrillas. So the only way to get news to the South was by steamboat. James Cass Mason will grab a bunch of Cairo newspapers proclaiming the death of Abraham Lincoln and will shoot downriver. He will take, and before he leaves, he takes and puts black bunting all over the Sultana, lowers the flag to half staff, and starts downriver. As he is going, they are ringing the bell. They are blowing their whistle, and they are letting all the river towns know that Abraham Lincoln has been assassinated. The Sultana is going down as the messenger of death. On April 17th, the Sultana will reach Vicksburg, and when it docks at Vicksburg, there's a couple things that happen. Not only does the Sultana notify all the Union authorities at Vicksburg that Abraham Lincoln has been assassinated, but a good friend of Lincoln, a man from Illinois named Captain Reuben Benton Hatch, will rush on board the Sultana. Of course, he's devastated by the news of his good friend Abraham Lincoln being killed. But more than that, he has a proposition for James Cass Mason. He knows that Mason is hurting for money because Mason had to stop at Vicksburg on a previous trip and have his boilers repaired. He knows that the Sultana needs money. And Reuben Hatch also needs money. He had been an Illinois businessman whose merchandising store had burnt down maybe about a half a year before, so he's looking for money. Well, sitting outside of Vicksburg in a parole camp are a number of recently reused Union prisoners of war from Andersonville Prison and from a place called Cahaba Prison just south of Selma, Alabama. The Civil War is coming to an end, and what happened was Southern authorities had contacted the Northern men at Vicksburg and said, look, the war is almost over. Could you send some food and some clothing through the lines to Cahaba Prison and to Andersonville Prison so we can start helping these people? Instead, at this meeting of both Union and Confederate officers, they agree instead to bring the prisoners from Cahaba and from Andersonville over to Vicksburg, where they will still be Confederate prisoners, but they will be controlled or they will be fed by the Northern soldiers, authorities. They will be given medical care. They will be clothed by the federal authorities, but they'll still be Confederate prisoners waiting for a man-to-man exchange. The South is waiting for their captive prisoners that are being held in Chicago and Rock Island, Illinois, to be sent downriver, and they will do a man for man, a private for a private, a lieutenant for a lieutenant exchange. Well, as the war goes, or as the war sort of goes bad for the South, and General Lee surrenders in Appomattox Courthouse, and Jefferson Davis goes on the president of the Confederacy goes on the run. It's finally decided, we're not getting those guys from the North to come down here, but why don't we start releasing all these men that are piling up at this camp called Camp Fisk? One of the men that is instrumental in Camp Fisk is this fellow right here, who is Captain Reuben Hatch. I told you about Captain Reuben Hatch meeting with Mason, and what he does is he meets with Mason, and he says, the federal government is paying steamboat captains to take a load of about 1,000 men upriver. If I can guarantee, Captain Hatch says this, if I can guarantee you 1,000 men or more, would you give me a kickback? Hatch knows that Mason is hurting for money, and Mason perhaps realizes that Hatch is also hurting for money, and they agree. The government will pay $2.75 per enlisted man and $8 per officer to carry them upriver. If Reuben Hatch gets even a 10% of that, he could make a good amount of money off of 1,000 men. So as the Sultana steams downriver, Captain Mason has a guarantee that when he comes back upriver from New Orleans, he will get at least 1,000 of these paroled prisoners. Now, what do these guys look like? Well, they came from Andersonville and from Cahaba. This is what a typical prisoner would have looked like from Andersonville. This is Epinetus W. McIntosh from the 14th Illinois Infantry. He was captured in October of 1864, and he weighed 175 pounds. When he was released from Andersonville 7 months later, he is down to 85 pounds. He lost 90 pounds while in prison. On this drawing here, you see there are these circles on his arm. These are scurvy sores from not having enough vitamin C. You can see how his clothing has just torn apart. Well, when he gets to Camp Fisk, he will sit around for a couple of weeks and be able to eat some food and gain a little bit of weight. And of course, the federal authorities are going to give him better clothing. But this would be a typical person of a person from Andersonville. Now, this is what the people look like from Cahaba. They were in a little bit better shape. Cahaba Prison only had a 2% death rate in the war. It was one of the best run prisons of the entire North and South. And that was because the commander was a Baptist minister, and he felt somewhat for his men. Yet, because the South could not even feed their own soldiers, they had a hard time feeding and clothing their own men. This is John Henry King, 9th Indiana Cavalry, who was going to be captured and sent to Cahaba. And this is a before and after shot. When he comes out of Cahaba, you can see he now has the sunken cheeks. His chest is even sunken down. He's lost that body mass that he had, and his clothing is just hanging on him in rags. These are typical of the people put on board the Sultana. You are not going to have the pictures of Andersonville where people look like the survivors of the Holocaust, just skin and bones, and can't even stand up. Those would never be placed on board the Sultana. They went into Vicksburg hospitals or put on hospital boats to be sent up to St. Louis. So everybody that went on board the Sultana had to be able to walk aboard, not be carried aboard. Well, the first group of soldiers to be released are placed aboard the steamboat called the Henry Ames, and they come from Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, what were considered the western states. There's a little bit over 1,300 that will be released. The next boat to come along is the Olive Branch, and it will take about 619 people from the eastern states, Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts. There's only 619 people ready because the authorities out at this Camp Fisk are having a heck of a time with the books that they got from the Confederacy. They were all jumbled. Whenever the Confederacy captured somebody, they just wrote their name in a book. So you could have an Illinois guy captured and then a Pennsylvania guy captured. His name goes second. A guy from Kentucky gets captured. His name goes third. They're all jumbled. At the camp, they are trying to, the northern authorities are trying to sort this out. And so when the Olive Branch arrives on April 23rd, there's only 619 people that they have got their names to be able to put on board the Olive Branch that they figured out from these Confederate books. Well, on April 23rd, late in the evening, the Sultana is approaching Vicksburg when it suddenly sprang a leak in one of its boilers. It will then lower the pressure in the boiler and limp into Vicksburg. The boilers have a setup such as this. This is where the fire stokers, the guys that put the coal into the boilers, would stand. They will open these doors here and throw the coal onto this grating. As it burns, the ash will fall into an ash pile, which is underneath. But the heat from the coal will take and be pulled by a draft underneath the boilers all the way to the back. Then it is pulled through the boiler. You're seeing a cross section here. So that it would go through some tubes that are inside the boiler. The boiler, of course, is filled with water. As the hot air goes through these tubes, it heats up the water. The hot air will eventually come up and go up through the chimney. Again, that's all by a draft, same as a chimney in your house. The boiling water will cause steam, which then goes into a steam drum. The steam from the steam drum goes down these steam lines and goes all the way to the engines, which control the paddle wheels, the two paddle wheels on the side of the Sultana. The Sultana had 4 boilers. And again, they were giving Mason all kinds of trouble. The leak was up in front here. As they get into Vicksburg, they're going to have that leak repaired, and James Cass Mason will run into Vicksburg to try to find Reuben Hatch and get his 1,000 men. However, when he gets there, Hatch says, we're having a problem with the books, and the men are not ready to go. Mason is fit to be tied, and eventually the Union authorities, and with the help of Captain Reuben Hatch, decide we'll put the last amount of men that are out at this Camp Fisk, all will go on the Sultana, because some of the other Union officers have heard that there's some bribery going around. They have no idea that it's Hatch that's really the kingpin of this bribery scheme. So they said, you know, we're going to put them all in the Sultana because we've heard that other boats are also offering a premium. They did not know that they were walking right into the hands of Reuben Hatch and James Cass Mason. So on the morning of April 24th, as the Sultana is waiting for the first group of soldiers to come be put on trains and brought to Camp Fisk, a bigger and newer steamboat shows up called the Lady Gay. Now, the Lady Gay also wanted some of these prisoners, and they do offer a bribe to some of the officers, but some of the more trustworthy officers say, no, they're all going on the Sultana. The Lady Gay will get nobody. So it steams upriver without a single man. So starting early in the morning of April 24th, the 3 train loads of Union paroled prisoners from Camp Fisk are brought into Vicksburg and placed aboard the Sultana. And you can see how crowded the decks of the Sultana are starting to come. At one point, another steamboat shows up called the Pauline Carroll, and they would also like some of these paroled men because, again, the government's going to pay you some money for them. However, the Union authorities loading the Sultana say, no, we have heard that the Pauline Carroll has offered a bribe and you can just leave. So the Pauline Carroll will leave with only 17 regular civilian passengers on board, not one single Union soldier. At one point during the loading, The officer in charge of these paroled prisoners, he was also a prisoner. He is the ranking officer, Major William H. Fidler of the 6th Kentucky Cavalry, will stop the 3rd train load and say, look it, you're already crowded, overcrowded with the 1st and 2nd train load. We are not going to put the 3rd train load of people on the boat. We want to have them put on that Pauline Carroll before it left. Well, the problem is some of the Union officers helping loading the Sultana say, you don't want to go on the Pauline Carroll. It's got smallpox on board. It did not, but that was the lie that they used. And these guys, being paroled prisoners in their weakened condition, said, okay, we'll chance going on board the Sultana and being as crowded as we are. We can survive crowding. We may not survive the smallpox. So the Sultana will be loaded with 300,000 pounds of sugar. The sugar are in these huge barrels called hogshead barrels that are put down in the hold, the bottom of the Sultana. You're also going to have 100 government horses and mules on the Sultana along the back end on the first deck. You're going to have 70 paying passengers. They probably paid for their tickets before these Union soldiers started coming on board, or I'm sure they probably would have said, I'm waiting for a different boat. So you have 70 paying passengers. You have a crew of about 85. You have 22 guards from the 58th Ohio Volunteer Infantry to make sure that all the men get fed and that there's no carousing and fights and stuff like that. And instead of 1,000 prisoners or even 1,300 prisoners, 1,959 soldiers, paroled Union soldiers, will be placed on board the Sultana, mostly from the states of Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, Michigan, and as I said, 20 from West Virginia and 1 individual from Virginia. You had on board 2,136 people on a boat that was legally registered to carry only 376 passengers and a crew of 85. Talk about being overloaded. Oh, and don't let me forget, the Sultana also had a pet alligator on board. It was kept in a sturdy little wooden crate. And of course, with some of these soldiers, they'd never seen a live alligator that close because they didn't have zoos like we have now. So these guys were poking sticks at it and watching the alligator snap and hiss at the sticks. And eventually what's going to happen is the crew feels sorry for this, and they will take that alligator in that nice sturdy wooden box and drag it and put it underneath in a closet underneath the main stairwell. And we will talk about the alligator in a bit. Now, the Sultana will start upriver against one of the worst spring floods in recent history. At some points, the river was 3 miles wide over the banks, and that was because the levees and the dikes along the river had really gone unattended for 4 years during the Civil War. Normally, the Army Corps of Engineers maintains these dikes and levees, but with the war going on, they were busy building forts, they were corduroying roads, they were working on entrenchments at Petersburg and such. So there's nobody to repair any breaks in the levee. And the water will overflow at some places up to 3 miles wide. So the Sultana will start upriver against this horrendous flood. And it maintains a rate of about 9 miles per hour against this strong current coming against it. That alone should show you that if you're maintaining a 9 mile per hour normal rate against a strong current, you're probably pushing your boilers a little harder than normal. The Sultana on April 26th in the morning will dock at Helena, Arkansas. And an enterprising photographer, Thomas W. Banks, will take this outrageous or awesome photograph of the Sultana with these crowded decks with all these guys on board. Now, I have studied this photograph for years, and this is the actual photograph that he would have taken. A lot of times you see a cropped image, and one of the things that you'll notice is that I'll go back one slide. If you can look at this closer, a lot of these guys they're not looking at the photographer, which is set up over here. They're looking into the city. Why are they looking at the city? Because the city of Helena was underwater. The spring flood had flooded the entire city. And in fact, at places, Union soldiers that were occupying Helena actually had to move about the city on rafts. This is a artillery caisson, perhaps a artillery piece right here. And these guys are pushing it along with poles in the flooded Mississippi River. Now here's a close-up. Again, I've studied this, and some of the things you're going to see is I've noted down here is a horse's head right here. I told you there was about 100 government horses. They were all along the back here, and along the other side. So here's an actual horse's head over the railing. You'll also see here is some laundry on a rail, on a line. These guys, they're probably needed their clothing washed or something, so they hung it out here to dry. Up here is a set of elk's antlers. What are they doing on here? Well, on the trip just prior to this one, the Sultana will set the record going from New Orleans to St. Louis in only 4 days and 7 hours. That was the fastest time on the river so far. Probably not only was James Cass Mason pushing his boilers as hard as he could, but also because so many fields were flooded, he didn't have to follow the curves of the river. He could just cut across, right across these fields, as long as they're deep enough. So he is awarded this Elk's Antlers as the fastest boat up to that time, and he quickly puts them on the between the smokestacks. What does that signify? If you're shipping freight and you're looking for the fastest boat, all you have to do is you see several steamboats docked at a levee. You look at the one with the Elk's Antlers, and that's the one you want. Why is this one person standing up so much taller than anybody else? He's standing on the one metallic lifeboat that the Sultana had. She had one metallic lifeboat that it was upside down, so it doesn't fill with water, and this guy's probably standing on top of it. When the disaster occurs, they're going to shove that boat into the water. It lands upside down, but still dozens of people jump into the water and grab onto it until one more person jumps overboard holding a wooden pole, and he punches a hole in the bottom of the boat, and the boat sinks and does not save a single person. There's also a little boat here called a sounding yawl, Y-A-W-L. This is used in low water. You take a crewman or 2 or 3 and you stick them out in front of the boat. And as you're going upriver, they're sending a weighted line, a line with a lead weight in the front of it into the water. They drop it in just to see how deep it is. You don't want to go too shallow. During the explosion, 5 deckhands will rush out to this boat, drop it into the water, and jump in, leaving behind at least 2 wives. These guys will just leave all these prisoners to whatever, leave their wives to whatever, and they row down to Memphis. They will eventually get all the way up to St. Louis, where somebody points out what they did, and they are arrested, and they are sent back to Memphis for trial, but we don't know what happened. We've never been able to find the transcripts to the trial, whether these guys spent the rest of their life in prison or just a little while or paid a fine or whatever. You will notice here there are some streaks on the side of the paddle wheel and some holes here. These are where the guys were going to the bathroom. There are only 2 bathrooms on a steamboat. One is here for the men and one behind the other paddle wheel for the women. If you're on the lower deck, there is another toilet here and another toilet on the other side. But for most of your passengers, they would use these bathrooms. There's no way that these crowded guys could come downstairs and go into the bathroom, especially if you have dysentery. So they were using fire buckets to go to the bathroom and then throwing the human waste over the side. That's why you have it here. You don't want to throw it over here because then it might blow back on people or back on the horses. So you threw it over the side, or you went to the bathroom by sitting on one of these cuts here and going to the bathroom right into the paddle wheel housing. These fire buckets are usually kept in a rack. They have a round bottom. They cannot be used as a regular mopping bucket because they will tip over. So what happened is during the trip from April 24th to April 26th or 27th, the guys on board will take these buckets out of the racks that they're supposed to be sitting in. They'll either tie ropes on them and drop them into the water to get water to drink, or they use them as waste buckets to go to the bathroom in. So when the steamboat explodes and a little fire starts, instead of being able to put this fire out with this water from the fire buckets, the buckets are not in the racks where they're supposed to be. Who knows where they are? And so a little fire that probably could have been contained will get out of hand and burn all the way to all the decks down. Now the Sultana, if I look at this, I do not see any of these prisoners in this area right here. It seems to be empty, except right here, you can see the image of a lady. Her name was Lucy Smith. Lucy Roth. She had gone downriver to meet her fiance. She will come upriver on the Sultana, and she was noted for having a beautiful singing voice because the Sultana will have a piano on board. And one of the soldiers that eventually buys a copy of this photograph will say, it's amazing that you could see her standing by the railing. She will not survive the disaster. Now, the Sultana will leave Helena and about 12 hours later dock at Memphis. While it's at Memphis, they will unload the 300,000 pounds of sugar that was down in the hold. Now, that sugar was actually acting as a ballast, and that causes a problem because now with all these men on the upper deck, the Sultana will now sort of tilt a little bit, and that's not good for your interconnected boilers. I'll show you that in just a second. The Sultana will leave Memphis and go upriver to Wolf River and take on some coal, and then it will start upriver about midnight on April 26th, and it follows this dotted line here. This is the line that you're supposed to follow to stay out of low water or even furious water. The Sultana will get about this far, and notice it has to cross from the Tennessee side over to the Arkansas side. While it is crossing, this strong current is hitting the Sultana in the side. And without that ballast, it starts to tilt. The Sultana had 4 interconnected boilers. Inside the boilers were 24 of those tubes that the hot air went through. And as long as you've got enough water above the boilers, and you should have about 3 inches, you're fine. But we do believe that the Sultana was running with less than that. Now, if the Sultana goes across the river and gets hit in the side, what's going to happen is the boat will tilt. And even if it tilts a little, the water from this upper boiler is going to flow down into the lower boiler, which now leaves these upper tubes here without any water surrounding them. But they still have hot air running through them. So these are going to turn red hot when the Sultana goes back to that even keel and the water from up here rushes down to here. It's going to hit these superheated tubes and it will turn to instant steam. If you do not have strong boilers, which the Sultana did not, the boilers were in a weakened condition. At 2 o'clock in the morning, 1 boiler explodes, followed by 2 more. So 3 boilers will explode on the Sultana. It was 7 miles north of Memphis, 2 o'clock in the morning. There's no street lights. There's no lights like that. Pitch dark. These guys had no idea what happened. The Sultana's explosion will come from the back end of the boiler and go straight or go upward at about a 45-degree angle. This should dispel any possibility that people have heard that, oh, it was sabotage. Somebody put a coal bomb, a coal torpedo into the furnace. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you right now, if they would have put a coal torpedo, and there was such an invention, a Confederate coal torpedo, it was a bomb made to look like a lump of coal on the outside, but inside was about 4 ounces of gunpowder. If the firemen would have thrown it in here, it would have exploded here and probably would have punctured the bottom of the boiler, which would have had the force of the explosion going downward and rip out the hull. The hull of the Sultana is not damaged. It will float for 5 hours before it eventually sinks. The explosion came from the top back and went upward. So that alone should show you it was not a coal torpedo. The explosion rips upward at a 45-degree angle, and it ripped off the pilot house. Without the pilot house, there is nobody to steer the boat and sort of steer it towards the bank where people could get off. So it becomes a floating hulk. Also, the 2 smokestacks, one will fall backwards into the hole, one falls forward, and it crushes the forward deck down into the second deck. Remember the picture, how crowded these decks were. And you would now have the smokestack falling onto the top deck, crushing down onto the second deck. Many, many people are going to be trapped between these 2 decks. Not knowing what happened at 2 o'clock in the morning, people start jumping overboard. There is a mad rush to get off of the bow until suddenly they realize, hey, The flames, which has started now, are blowing towards the stern. These guys on the bow, the ones that have not jumped overboard, say, "Hey, why don't we just stay here? The flames are going backwards. The wind is blowing it backwards. We can stay here. We're safe." So about 500 guys are going to congregate on the bow as the flames go back. But that caused problems for all these guys behind the flames. They suddenly started jumping over onto each other. One of the families that's going to be on board was Harvey and Ann Annis and their 8-year-old daughter, Isabella, or Belle. Harvey will take and put Belle on his back, tie a life belt around himself and a life belt around Ann. And as they leave from this main cabin area and they're climbing out one of these back windows, Harvey lowers himself down with his daughter into the water. But as Ann is coming down, somebody jumps from the top here, hits her, knocks her back into the boat. She eventually will climb into the water, but she notices that her life belt is on wrong. So she will float over to the rudder, and she holds on to the rudder, and she's trying to correct her life belt. Her daughter and her husband disappear. Their bodies are never found. She will be only one of 2 civilian women out of about 17 or 18 that were on board. No children survive out of about between 5 and 10 that we know of. Only 2 civilian women. One is Ann Annis. Now, as the Sultana is burning, a steamboat comes downriver, the Bostona, and they do come to the assistance, throwing off all kinds of debris, shutters, deck chairs, the wooden stage plankings like you see here. Everything is shoved off to try to help the men. They throw out lines. They will pull in about 250 survivors when the captain of the Sultana, or the Bostona, a man named John Watson, makes the decision to leave the scene of the disaster and head downriver to Memphis to try to let people know that there was a major disaster 7 miles upriver. Other steamboats better get there. He does rush down to Memphis. The only problem is it takes a long time to build up pressure to steam and those boilers. In the meantime, the docked steamboats at Memphis will send out their rowboats to try to rescue people that are starting to float past Memphis. In the meantime, at the Sultana, the paddle wheel will finally burn away and fall into the river, but it does not break away. So what happens is the strong current will hit this side of the paddle wheel. It now looks like one of those outrigger canoes from Hawaii, and it starts to turn the vessel. So all those guys that had been on the front, once the boat turns, all that flames and stuff is going to be pushed towards them. And there's a second mad rush off the bow. But this time there's nothing to grab, because the first group has grabbed the pieces of wood from the explosion and the door shutters and things like that. So this is another mass drowning on the bow. Those 500 guys that sought refuge now have to jump overboard. One man who was actually blown off the boat was John Simpson, 3rd Tennessee Cavalry, only 17 years old on the boat, 16 years old when he was captured. He gets blown off the boat. He's hit in the head. He's got a concussion, but he's more worried about that darn alligator. But he didn't have to worry, because William Lugenbeal from the 135th Ohio Infantry also remembered that alligator. And he remembered the sturdy wooden crate that the alligator in. So he will kill the alligator. They say runs it through with a couple of stabs from a bayonet, drops it on the deck, takes the sturdy wooden box, throws it into the water, and floats down river on it, using that as his own private rowboat. He will be forever known as William Lugenbeal, who was saved by an alligator. This is a curio box that we have in our Sultana Disaster Museum. We've also purchased some red clay from Andersonville that he collected years afterwards when he visited Andersonville again. And here is a little carving, a little ivory carving of an alligator. Also in our museum, we have recently found a nice cane that was given to him by his GAR brothers. On one side, it says William Lugenbeal. On the second side, it says 135th Ohio. On the third side, it says Sultana Survivor. And on the fourth side, saved by an alligator. Rest of his life, that's what he was known as, the guy that was saved by an alligator. The Sultana will blow up blow its boilers up way up north, 7 miles north, and float all the way downriver and lodge at what was called Hen Island. This is Patty's Hen and Chicken Islands. Here's the hen, here's the little chickens to the side. It will lodge there, and about 7 in the morning, it will finally burn through the hull and sink. Some people from Mound City or living around here will go out with a raft and try to rescue any people that climb back on board once the flames died away. And they become the big rescuers. Even though they had Confederate sentiment, they became big rescuers of these people on the Sultana and rescuing people from the overflowed treetops, because the flooding has left only the treetops above the water. Other men are now starting to float all the way down to Memphis, and they are being rescued by, at first, little rowboats from the steamboats, and eventually the steamboats themselves will go out on the rescue. In the morning, the water is literally littered with people from the Sultana. The people of Memphis, even though that was a ex-Confederate city, will again drop their southern sentiment or northern sentiment and rush out and really do a great job in helping to rescue people from the Sultana. Over 750 people are going to be rescued and taken to Memphis hospitals. Out of that number, only about 31 will die in the hospital. And I always think that if you had survived until 7 o'clock in the morning from a 2 o'clock explosion, chances are you were going to survive. If you were going to die, you probably would have died somewhere during that 5 hour of time. Memphis will also bring out all the bodies of the guys, and they lay them along the wharf until eventually they run out of coffins and they have to lay them out and just put blankets on top of them. And soldiers will walk up and down looking for brothers, fathers, relatives, friends, trying to identify somebody among these collected bodies. Now, some of the men are actually going to float past Memphis, and they get down here where there's an area called Fort Pickering. And at first, it's garrisoned by some United States colored troops, some black soldiers, and they were told that if you see a rowboat out here, you are first to hail it and say, "Come ashore. What are you doing out there?" And if they don't attend to your hail, fire at them. They could be Confederate guerrillas. So a lot of these rowboats that are saving people are now starting to float down here, and they're so busy rescuing people from the water that when the guards yell at them to come ashore, they either didn't hear or don't respond, and the guards start shooting at these guys. Well, eventually one rowboat goes over and says, "Hey guys, what are you doing? We're trying to rescue these guys from Sultana." At that point, the guards at Fort Pickering will then take and also help in the rescue. Major Fidler will die in the disaster. He jumps into the water to save a civilian lady, and he is pulled underwater by a lot of struggling men. His body is never found. James Cass Mason also dies in the disaster. He lives through the explosion. He is seen trying to help out by throwing pieces of wood and shutters into the water, but again, his body is never found. Of the people that were on board the Sultana, 2,136, there were at least 1,169 that died. You may have heard other amounts, 1,500, 1,700, 1,800. 5 years ago, when I retired, I decided to look into this, and I have verified 1,169 died and over 950 survivors. And it's all verified, believe me. The Sultana did get some recognition in the newspapers, especially some of the bigger towns, river towns such as St. Louis and Cincinnati, Paducah, Kentucky. They ran information on the Sultana for weeks and weeks and weeks. In the bigger newspapers of New York and Boston and Philadelphia, they originally ran some stories on the Sultana, but when it was found out that these guys had come from Ohio and Indiana and Kentucky and Michigan and West Virginia, they said, those aren't our soldiers, so let's drop the story. So the Sultana got buried. Plus, remember what's going on. Lincoln's body is being brought across the northern states. They're looking for John Wilkes Booth. The day before, they had just found and shot John Wilkes Booth. I'm sorry, they were looking for the president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis. Joe Johnston will surrender the second largest Confederate army on April 26, one day before the Sultana. So you got a lot of things in the newspaper crowding out the story of the death of all these Western soldiers. Only one man is put on trial for the Sultana. His name is Captain Frederic Speed. He was actually out at the parole camp, putting the men on the train and sending them into town. But for some reason, they put him up as a scapegoat. He will be found guilty until it is the court records are sent to the judge advocate in Washington, who looks at it and says, no, this guy's a scapegoat. The real guy was Reuben Hatch. Reuben Hatch, however, had quit the service. He ignores 3 subpoenas, and when they put out a writ of attachment where a U.S. Marshal is sent out to arrest him, he goes into hiding, and he is never brought to justice. If you were to rank the Sultana among Civil War battles of Northern dead, it would rank number 12. It is outranked, of course, by Gettysburg, Antietam, Cold Harbor, Shiloh, many of your larger battles, and battles that took place over 3 or 4 days. The dead on the Sultana, 1,047 soldiers, this is not including civilian deaths, died within a 5-hour span. Compare the Sultana to the Titanic. The Sultana had about the same amount of people on board, yet look at this difference in size. The Sultana was only 260 feet long compared to 882. About the same amount of people, so you can imagine how crowded it would have been on the Sultana. If we compare the soldier losses on the Sultana to the U.S. Arizona, bombed on December 7, 1941, you can see there is just 130 deaths less than the sailors and Marines that died on the Arizona. Interesting, though, everybody remembers Pearl Harbor and remembers the Arizona. Few people remember the Sultana. A largest maritime disaster, which happened right here in the heart of America, where you can visit the museum, you can visit even the burial spot where the Sultana remains. It's hard to get out and visit the USS Arizona, although many, many, many people do. We do have a museum in Marion, Arkansas, right across the river from Memphis. It's in Marion because this is the closest to the actual wreckage of the Sultana. When the Sultana sank, every year it was covered over with silt when the river would overflow, and eventually the river changed courses, and it's now about 2 miles inland. We are currently, in fact, right at this moment, Governor Asa Hutchinson of Arkansas is giving a speech to at a fundraising event to try to pay for and build a permanent Sultana Disaster Museum. This is our interim museum, 1,000 square feet. Our permanent museum will have over 22,000 square feet. So, ladies and gentlemen, that does it for me. You notice I did write on here, and as Sean mentioned, I do have a new book on the Sultana. My original book came out in 1996. It's been 25 years. I've continued to research. We at the museum have continued to research. There's so much new material. In fact, the new numbers, only 1,200 deaths as compared to 15 or 17 or 1,800. It's all going to be in my new book out next year. And Sean, that is it. So I'm going to stop sharing and see what happens.
I'm here, Gene. Thank you.
Okay. There we go. Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, an amazing story. Incredibly sad story.
It is. It is.
And I'm familiar with another maritime disaster. Did General Slocum, I think it was.
Correct.
How do they compare in terms of?
They are second. The General Slocum was an excursion boat that burned, caught. I don't know how it caught fire, if it exploded or caught fire on the. I believe it's the Hudson River in New York, and it is second only to the Sultana. The General Slocum had like 1,011 or something like that. The Sultana beats it by at least 150, perhaps 175. Depending on what figures. But the Sultana is the largest maritime disaster in American history. General Slocum is number 2. And of course, I live in the Chicago area, and we had the Eastland disaster, which was an excursion boat that overloaded while it was docked in the Chicago River about to go on an excursion, and it capsized, flipped over, and about 800 people died. So we have a lot of maritime disasters.
Right, and none of them are well known except the Titanic. Why do you suppose?
Right. Right.
What's your opinion on why that is?
Number of reasons. Of course, you had the wealthy on board the Titanic. Also, the Titanic was, they never said it, but newspapers had advertised it was the unsinkable the unsinkable Titanic. It was on its maiden voyage. It had all these rich, the more J.P. Morgans and Vanderbilts and all these people on board. So that's why. And even though it's not an American vessel, it was a British vessel. That's why the Sultana is still the largest American maritime disaster. But the Sultana does eclipse it by about 400 deaths, maybe about 300 deaths. But that's why. And again, the Sultana, it was crowded out of the papers because of the end of the Civil War. So much going on at one time. And again, when these papers like Boston and Philadelphia and New York discovered that these guys were Westerners, at that time, Illinois and Ohio and Kentucky, that was considered the West. The newspaper, the big Eastern newspapers dropped it and started covering Lincoln's funeral procession train across the northern states.
Right. Let's take a couple of questions from the audience before we get to Senator Weld's resolution.
Sure.
The first one.
It did not. I can read this. Carolyn, the Sultana did not have cotton bales at this time. It had the 300,000 pounds of sugar. It had some cases of wine, which I'm pretty sure they didn't let the soldiers know about. And that may have been why they had the guards on board also. It had the 100 government horses. And there may have been some other things, but no cotton bales at this time. Of course, in the 2 years history of before the explosion, it had on numerous occasions carried bales of cotton. But at this time, no. The decks were just covered with the soldiers.
Yeah, it occurs to me sometimes when you see the ships of soldiers returning from Europe and after World War I, they looked overcrowded as well. I don't know if it's...
Oh, sure. Yeah. Absolutely right. Absolutely right.
Yeah. Here's another question.
No. Did he get his pay? No, he did not. Hatch is a really unusual or interesting story. I am hired by some of these modern day steamboat companies when they have their Civil War tours to give 3 lectures. I give the same one you guys just got on the Sultana. I give a lecture on just Hatch. And the third one might be on the Cahaba prison camp or might be on something else. But Hatch does not get the money. Because Mason would not have gotten the money until he reached his destination, and they were figured out how many people were on board and how many miles you went, and they were paid per 100 miles per guy. So Mason does not. The surviving owners of the Sultana did not. They recouped nothing because there was no insurance on a steamboat at that time. They will try to sell whatever can be salvaged. The engines are pulled up. One remaining boiler is pulled up, and the surviving owners will try to sell that and try to recoup some loss. Hatch will leave the service, and he takes with him over $19,000 of government money from the Vicksburg safe, and he says he's transporting it up to turn over to the quartermaster because he was a chief quartermaster at Vicksburg. He was going to turn it over to the chief quartermaster at St. Louis. On the trip, however, the safe is robbed, and of course, they just dock in the middle of the river and they search the boat, and they will recover, about like $9,000. I think that they recover about $8,000 or $9,000. There's about $9,000 missing. Eventually, Hatch is held responsible because he did not have a bonded courier. However, the United States will sue the steamboat company for the loss of this government funds. Interesting enough, during the trial, Hatch will buy into a lease system with the state of Illinois leasing out the Joliet State Prison, and it cost Hatch $9,000 to buy into this lease. Gee, where did he get that $9,000? So he got it from the safe of this steamboat. He is a character entirely throughout his whole life. He should never have been there for the Sultana because he had been court-martialed for being a crook, but because he was a personal friend of Abraham Lincoln, Lincoln will repeatedly step in and say, I know Hatch, he's a good guy. Please, make him the next quartermaster at this place or this place or this place. He never, ever spends a day in prison, unfortunately.
And that was Gene's follow-up question about whether the rest of his life was known or did he vanish?
Oh, no. Well, we didn't know for the longest time. We didn't even have a photograph for the longest time. And I used to tell people, I don't think he wanted a photograph because he didn't want to end up in the wall of a post office, wanted, dead or alive. So he didn't, but we finally figured out who that person is in that Camp Fisk picture. And he will only live until, I believe it's 1872 he dies, because he's an alcoholic. He dies of alcohol poisoning, and he's got some other medical problems. The interesting thing, his headstone says he was the colonel of the 8th Illinois Infantry, and he wasn't. He was a lieutenant when he was part of the 8th Illinois Infantry. So even his headstone is a lie. But you can't blame him for that. Somebody else bought that headstone for him.
Okay, quickly before we get to Senator.
Sure.
How did Hatch know Lincoln? Gene wants to know.
Lincoln had been his personal lawyer for a couple. When Hatch owned his general merchandising store, he had been sued, or he had to sue a couple of people at times for payments. And Lincoln was his personal lawyer for 3 years. And eventually, the lawsuit goes all the way to the Illinois Supreme Court. And one of Hatch's sons remembered that Lincoln would come over and get down on the rug and play with the kids. So it was more than just a client, lawyer relationship. It was a personal friend relationship. And I saw that. And Hatch's brother, Ozias M. Hatch, is the Secretary of State of Illinois. And there's the very famous pictures of Lincoln going to the battlefield of Antietam, where he meets with General McClellan afterwards. One of the guys in that picture next to Lincoln is Ozias M. Hatch. Ozias M. Hatch and Abraham Lincoln shared a tent on that trip. So the Hatch family and the Lincoln family were really tight.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Gene, thank you very much. That was a riveting presentation, really. Great story.
Sean, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm so glad to be a part of this. And I'm so glad that West Virginia is recognizing their sons that were on board the Sultana, 20 of them, and not all of them will return, as you will soon find out. Thank you.
Thanks, Gene. And let me bring Senator Weld on now. Now, before we
How are you?
Hi, Senator Weld.
John.
Welcome.
Thank you.
I just want to remind people before you speak that there will be a program on the Wheeling and West Virginia men in June. Is it June 28, Gene? Yeah, June 28 at 6:30 p.m. at the Scottish Rite Cathedral on 14th Street, so you can hear more about that story. Now, as I mentioned, we are welcoming now Senator Weld, who is going to read for us a resolution on behalf of the soldiers of West Virginia, and I'll give him the floor.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate you guys making me part of the agenda today. I certainly thank Gene for bringing this to my attention. I consider myself to be pardon the expression, quite the history nerd, but I was not aware of the Sultana until she brought it to my attention. So it was my pleasure to do Senate Resolution 21 this past session on the SS Sultana. Whereas the explosion of the SS Sultana on April 27, 1865 is considered the worst maritime disaster in American history. Whereas the Steamboat Sultana was one of the largest business steamers constructed with a capacity of 376 passengers plus crew members when it launched from Litherby Boatyard in Cincinnati, Ohio on January 3, 1863. During the Civil War, the Sultana was frequently commissioned to carry troops and supplies due to its size and efficiency. And whereas on April 24, 1865, during a stop at Vicksburg, Mississippi, a series of hasty repairs to the Sultana's boilers were made, and nearly 2,000 Union soldiers who had been recently released from the Confederate prison camps Andersonville and Cahaba were crowded aboard for the trip north along the Mississippi River. And whereas on April 27, 1865, at 2 a.m., The dangerously overloaded Sultana exploded and sank 7 miles north of Memphis, Tennessee. A massive conflagration of fire and flying shrapnel caused by the boat's inadequately repaired boilers as the boat worked to overcome the strong currents of a flooded Mississippi River. And whereas more than 1,100 of the nearly 2,200 passengers aboard lost their lives in the tragedy, including both initial survivors of the explosion who later died from burns, hypothermia, or exposure. And whereas this disaster occurred 12 days following the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln and less than 3 weeks after the end of the Civil War, it received very little attention and is scarcely remembered today. And whereas among the Union soldiers killed in the catastrophic accident were 10 West Virginians: Private Anthony Craig, Private William Crudis, Private John Hudson, Sergeant James H. Lyons, Private Alexander A. Manners, Private Thomas McGinnis, Private John Wesley Steele, Private Alan Ramsey C. Stevens, Private John D. Wayhurt, and Private John Welch. And therefore, be it resolved by the Senate that the Senate hereby recognizes the anniversary of the tragic accident of the SS Sultana, and be it further resolved that the Senate, on the 156-year anniversary of the tragic accident of the SS Sultana, honors the memory of all soldiers and passengers who lost their lives in this disaster. And be it further resolved that the clerk is hereby directed to forward a copy of this resolution to the director of the Sultana Disaster Museum in Marion, Arkansas. And the Senate adopted that resolution during our legislative session. I believe we did it in February, and a copy was indeed sent to the museum in Marion, Arkansas. And I believe that Gene received a copy of it as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
My pleasure.
Thanks very much. An honor to have you here. I want to remind everyone now that the date of the Wheeling Men of the Sultana has been changed to June 21 at 6:30 at the Scottish Rite. I want you, if you're in the area, to support the museum. Go see it. This proclamation will be there, as you heard. And I want to thank Gene again and check out his books, his first book and his new book that's coming out next year. And thank everyone who attended today. And we'll see you next week for Alan Fitzpatrick, another in his trilogy on the frontier and Wheeling. Goodbye, everyone.